Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Keisha Middlemass, a fellow at Brookings, and I'm your moderator. Today, we've got a great panel of experts that will discuss Black voters, Black voting, and the 2024 election, and general politics and current events as it's related to the 2024 presidential election. But first, before I introduce our panelists, some housekeeping matters. As this is a webinar, audience members are welcome to submit questions via Twitter, X, whatever you want to call Twitter these days. And you can do that at Brookings.gov. So that's at BROOKINGS.gov. And you can use a hashtag Black Voters 2024, or you can email your questions to events@brookings.edu. That's events, EVENTS, @brookings.edu. Now to our panelists. I am so thankful and appreciative of the following panelists. We have Dr. Ashley Daniels. She's a presidential postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, Irvine, and she's project director of Black Vote Research Network of Black Girls Vote. Dr. Rashawn Ray, he's a senior fellow in governance studies at Brookings. Matt Brown is with us. He is the race and politics reporter for the Associated Press. And Dr. Marcus Board, who's an associate professor of political science at Howard University. So thank you to our audience for spending some time with us this afternoon. Rashawn, I'm going to turn to you to start off this conversation. If you could just provide a short history about Black voters, rational actors, and how Black voters are not a monolith, but also hold a different set of political ideologies.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me, Keisha. I think that that's such an important question. And really, it deals with a fallacy that we have in the United States and around the world, and not just with non-Black people, but even with Black people as well, which is this narrative that some sort of way that Black people do not vote. That is completely a fallacy and a stereotype about Black people, and part of a trope that actually tries to drive home the fact that the Black vote matters less than it actually does. One thing that I know from doing research on Black voting over the past 3 or 4 decades is that Black people actually vote on par, if not higher, than other racial groups. If we just look at presidential elections, voter turnout has actually been fairly stable since the 1980s, except for, say, 1992 or even 96 and 2000, where there was a slight dip. And while whites have traditionally had the highest voter turnout relative to other racial groups, Blacks have had higher voter turnout than Hispanics and Asians. And in fact, Black voter turnout was within 1 percentage point of whites in 2008. So it was 65% for Blacks, 66% for whites, and was actually higher than whites in 2012, where 66.6% of Blacks turned out to vote compared to 64% of whites. In 2016, voter turnout dipped a little bit. And while that number was lower than whites, it was still higher than Asians and Hispanics. When we look at battleground states, whether they be Ohio or even some others that people are saying are in play or have been in play in recent presidential elections, whether it be Michigan or Wisconsin, and of course, Georgia, what we've seen is that Black people are playing a huge role in Black voter turnout in those areas, particularly for Democrats. We know that Black people are significantly more likely to vote Democrat than Republican. But I mean, if we go back 100 years, over 100 years, we actually see that Black people were more likely to vote Republican. Of course, that was Lincoln's party, and the Republican Party today, even though they claim Lincoln's party, is quite different from the culture and the ethos of what the Republican Party was at the end of the Civil War and into the beginning of the 1900s. So when we look at this, the Black electorate is extremely important. And as you noted, the other part of this is that Black people are not a monolith. Even though Black people overwhelmingly vote Democrat, when we actually look at state elections, when we look at local elections, we see much more variation among Black people that has a lot to do with immigrant status, has to do with social class, education level, and also has a lot to do with the way that people actually consume information. So when we look at this, we really have to break it down and look at what is happening with Black people and realize that it's not simply a monolith, that Black people actually do turn out to vote And Black people are very rational in their choices. Oftentimes, they are choosing between the lesser of two evils because we have an overly simplistic two-party system. And then the other part of this, there are some people who would rather stay at home than vote for someone who they don't think aligns with their particular politics and their cultural values. And I think that is the big thing that is happening with this particular election. It's not just voter turnout, but whether or not people might stay home compared to voting for someone who they don't necessarily want to.
Thank you for that brief history, because it's important to note that Black voters or Black people turn out to vote. They're rational actors. They're not a monolith, but the two-party system does direct voters to choose either a Republican or a Democrat. Ashley, you're on the ground right now, and you, in your role as project director, work with community organizations and individuals, and you really do help to support political empowerment of Black girls and women. So as we know in recent elections, particularly stand out in Georgia, that Black women are a powerhouse behind the Democratic Party wins. So can you talk about this expansion of Black women and political organizing emerging, particularly since 2020?
Absolutely. And again, thank you for, having me at this wonderful panel. One of the things that I've noticed as a researcher and then also as a project director for Black Girls Vote is that in recent years, I've seen that there's been an elevation, so to speak, of more, Black women organizations taking a research-based approach in terms of how they are interacting with communities. Recently, we've been looking at Black women organizations like the National Coalition of Black Civic Participation. We've seen NCNW. We've seen Higher Heights, She the People. These, and I name these organizations, Black Girls Vote included, because recently these organizations essentially have started doing surveys of their membership to kind of get a gauge on how voters are feeling about this election. Some of the things that we've been in conversation about with numerous organizations is that, we know that there's an enthusiasm gap in the 2024, election essentially. But one of the responses, to that enthusiasm gap is really drilling down and seeing, what are some of the things that, Black voters are concerned about. As it was said, so eloquently by Rashawn earlier, that, Black folks are not a monolith when it comes to their vote. And in that, it should also be highlighted that they're not a monolith when it comes to some of their concerns as voters. Looking at some of the data, you have, numerous reasons why that there's an enthusiasm gap. You have, some Black folks that are, concerned about the ceasefire, that's going on in Gaza. And you have some Black folks that are concerned about reproductive justice. You have others that are concerned about economics. So there's like a variance, essentially in terms of some of the voter apathy or, some of the the lower enthusiasm that we are seeing essentially going on right now. So I really, again, just applaud these organizations and taking a very action research centered approach and saying that, we're not just going to, rest on this one idea or past ideas of what we have about voters. We're actually going to, do the research, hear what's going on, and actually craft strategies to respond to that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So Marcus, and talking about this idea that Black voters are varied in their approach, there has been polling and research done that there's a steady, approximately 8 to 10% in presidential elections of Black people, men and women, Black conservative voters, voting for the Republican Party. Can you talk more about this group of Black conservatives who identify with the Republican Party?
Yeah, and thanks again for having me. It's great to be here with you all. So Black voters have always voted for the Republican Party or the more conservative party. Black voters in general, when we talk about ideology, are very consistently conservative. It's to this question of whether or not they're going to vote for the Republican or Democratic Party that actually changes things. And so as the Republican Party has pushed even further to the right, particularly since the Bush administration, this is Bush 2 in 2000, as the Republicans have pushed further to the right and the Democrats have followed suit, and this is Clinton in 92 since then we've seen Black voters have complicated feelings about whether or not their support and whether or not the candidates are actually going to be representing their interests and needs. And so when the Republican Party shows up and does so in a way that is a little more outwardly antagonistic towards Black people and Black voters, then we see people less willing to support that party despite their some conservative leanings. And so it's this complicated dance that people are doing to try and figure out, how do we navigate this party system while also trying to get our needs met and trying to get our interests represented. But there's been a lot of talk lately, a little surprise, I'm not sure why, about around 10% of 8 to 12%, I'd say, of Black men voting Republican. But that's been the case for some time now, and it doesn't look to change. The reality is that if you have a group of people where even at the most extreme, where 88% of them are voting for the Democratic Party, then they are not responsible for any election outcome other than the Democratic Party victory. So it's one of those things where we like to blame constituents, we like to blame voters, we like to make them responsible for what happens with elected officials. But when we do that, we actually don't pay attention to all of the ways that voters are trying to signal to representatives that they can be more representative. So it's one of those things where it's a matter of perspective, I think, in a lot of ways, to understand what this information is telling us.
Very good. Yes, indeed. So, Matt, as a reporter and on the ground and talking to different Black voters, but let's focus on Black men. What can you report out about their public support for Trump and or the GOP? Because I know sometimes those are two different questions if they're going to support Trump versus supporting Republican candidates.
Absolutely. Thank you also for having me here. This is a wonderful panel. So this is an interesting year, as Marcus just mentioned. A lot of folks are having attention on Black male voters and focused on this question of, are Black men and in general communities of color potentially shifting right in this year? And as everyone has already said, this is an interesting question for someone for anyone actually who has approached different communities of color across the country, especially Black communities, because there has always been deep diversity geographically, socioeconomically, culturally across the Black community here in the United States. And I think that's something that's very important for us to recognize. The question, though, is what are the politically salient questions that people are asking, and why for so long have there not been partisan differences in terms of how Black voters have historically voted? And for the longest time, the fundamental question of that has been questions of democracy and political salience for Black voters. For the first 100 years since the Civil War, the Black voters had any constitutional rights, shall we say, whether or not they were enforced. Black voters overwhelmingly, when they could, supported Republicans because they were the party that Black voters believed, regardless of whatever their other political preferences were. There was a question of democracy and whether or not Black voters would be enfranchised against white supremacy in the Jim Crow South. Then after that, when the Democrats became the party that, in Black voters' eyes especially, embraced civil rights, then Black voters overwhelmingly backed them, because regardless of what other policy priorities Black voters had, especially Black men, people were prioritizing questions of democracy and voting rights. And setting aside the fact that a lot of Black voters also, by and large, historically have agreed with the Democratic Party platform economically as well. I think that this brings us to this moment where we're potentially seeing not just a shift in terms of the policy preferences of Black voters, particularly Black men, but also the salience of the things that Black voters are finding important in this election here. When I go to different communities across the country, it's not a complete sea change. I don't think anyone's talking right now about, oh my God, like Black men are going to be completely won by Trump. Well, actually, I do talk with some activists who will say that, but I do think that it's important to recognize that when you go and talk with Black men in different communities, Trump does have a particular appeal oftentimes, whether it's his personality or whether it's the things that he's talking about and highlighting, that you do see is sometimes borne out from some of the shifts that we're seeing in the polls when you anecdotally do talk to people in your reporting. I think that that's an important thing to recognize, that we're not just seeing a osmosis, I guess, of Black men suddenly just waking up one day and saying, I'm just suddenly decided I'm a Republican, but that there is genuine shifts in the overall political environment that is making Trump's Republican Party more amenable to Black men in some ways. And I think that that's the question that is not necessarily one of an intractable shift that is inevitably going to happen in November. Many Democratic strategists and many Black male activists will tell you that this is, probably a blip. Some of them will even reject the data. But I do think that it's important to note that what we are seeing, and the thing that we should take away from this, is not suddenly that Black men have discovered some latent conservatism that they weren't aware of before, but that the political environment is such that Black men are actually being able to think about what are the policies that they really want out of this environment, and whether it's voting on economics more, or believing that Trump has a better policy or a better brand, or being averse to President Joe Biden and whatever Black voters' views of him as a person are, not necessarily just his platform. I think that is the dynamic that is causing some of the polling here when I actually go and talk to people on the ground.
Thank you so much. So, Rashawn, I'd like you to add to this dynamic of this changing dynamic within Black men and voting. We know that Black women are organizing and supporting Democratic candidates, but in these competitive elections, as you mentioned in the opening, 5-6% of voters in certain states like a Michigan or Wisconsin will change the outcome. So can you elaborate a little bit more on these politically salient questions that Black men may be attracted to Trump and the Republican Party?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, I think Matt highlighted it very well. And one big part of these shifts over time is that our overly simplistic two-party system makes the assumption that either you're on the right or the left. And as Matt and Marcus highlighted, we've actually seen a shift to the right, which means not only are Republicans farther toward the right, but also Democrats are as well. And don't get me wrong, there is a progressive wing. But if we had more political parties, we might see moderate Republicans being disconnected from far right extremists. Similarly, we might see more moderate, laissez-faire, capitalist type of Democrats being disconnected from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And part of what's happening then is if a person, say, wanted to vote for Bernie, say 8 years ago, well, they might have actually tipped to Trump. And I know some people are trying to figure that out. And I think that's because oftentimes political ideology is linear. It's not, I mean, it's circular. It's not always linear. So we view it in a circular fashion. People tip over to the other side and people start hearing these different sound points. I brought this up earlier, but the role of social media is a really, really big deal. Why is that? Because people are less likely to watch the news. So if you're less likely to watch the news, either because you distrust it or you don't have time or you just have more access on your phone, then you're being fed certain types of messages that might not always align with the traditional ways that we received information. You mentioned Michigan and Wisconsin. Of course, we talked about others, Georgia and Ohio, where literally just a few votes separate candidates. If we go back to Clinton versus Trump and even Trump versus Biden, and now we're seeing that again, is that a third party candidate, say like Robert Kennedy Jr. or even Cornel West, could all of a sudden move some votes away from Biden or Trump, depending on the state. And part of what's happening with Black men as well, it's not only about the individuals who can actually vote, it's also about the high percentage of them that are actually disenfranchised from voting. We know that roughly 40% of the people who cannot vote due to a previous felony conviction are Black. And the total number of voter disenfranchisees is over 6 million. And so that means roughly 1 out of every 13 Black people are actually disenfranchised from voting, and they are overwhelmingly Black men. And so part of what is happening is that while we are seeing Black women who have mobilized in a bunch of ways, Black men are mobilizing as well. We just don't talk about it in the same way. And part of what they're mobilizing against is the establishment. You know, one thing that the Democratic Party and Biden really have to deal with is not only thinking about the 1994 crime bill that a lot of people in the Black community and elsewhere blame him and others for this disenfranchisement. And even though he's distanced himself and he's talked about the Domestic Violence Act to protect women, he's talked about getting guns off the street, but overwhelmingly Democrats are not good messengers of all of the things that they are doing, whether that be around student loan forgiveness or dealing with AI and equity, whether that be dealing with the earned income child credit and trying to continue these particular things. So when we put this all together, Black men oftentimes are not receiving those messages. Instead, they might be going to what they call YouTube University, and that is where they're getting their news from. And this is part of the reason why political parties are starting to gather social media influencers, which just recently happened in DC, where they brought together people with millions of followers to try to talk to them about what they are doing, because they are recognizing that the traditional modes of communication, whether that be through the news or at a rally, are not necessarily reaching Black men in the same way that it is other groups.
Thank you. So before we turn to current events, just a reminder to the audience that you can submit questions via X/Twitter at BrookingsGov using the hashtag BlackVoters2024, or you can email your questions to events@brookings.edu. So turning to current events, literally unfolding this morning, more protests on campuses, unfolding events in Gaza. So I'd like to first ask Matt, can you report about what Black voter support and or feelings about the Biden administration on the conflict in Gaza?
Yes. So according to recent AP polling, we do know that a majority of Black voters, a little over half, still do approve of Joe Biden's overall handling of his presidency. Though we do have significant signs that Black voters are, should I say, overall, all Americans have decreased or trended down in their general support of how Israel is handling its war in Gaza, and consequently have become more apprehensive about the Biden administration's support for the Israeli government in its conduct. I should note that we don't necessarily have as much recent polling, given Biden's recent shift on this issue in some ways, where he has said that should the Israelis, for instance, have an unmitigated assault on the Gazan city of Rafah, then he would not give them, certain types of precise military equipment. And has been also called for a ceasefire and expressed concern basically for Palestinian civilians. I think that it is important, in particular for Black communities, to note that many Black voters see oftentimes parallels with the Palestinian experience under Israeli occupation in many ways, along with the Black experience here in the United States, which I think is something that's become very resonant in these protests. We just published a story this morning about protests at Morehouse University, for instance, where Biden is going to be speaking on Sunday, where a lot of people were drawing those parallels and arguing that, for instance, a Morehouse alumnus, Martin Luther King Jr., would not have approved of Biden's conduct in Israel, Gaza, citing his concerns, for instance, over the Vietnam War. So I think that this is something that is very important to Black Americans because of the political history of, in many ways, sometimes the Black radical tradition, a very an activist spirit, a spirit and culture of moral clarity, oftentimes in both the Black establishment and rank and file Black voters. And that's something that's being bared out in the polling, and just when we go talk to the voters, that this is something that is important to people, because not just because of people's opinions on foreign policy, but because of people's lived experience and conceptions of the world.
Thank you. So Marcus, we know that young people, actually people of all ages, are engaged in these protests, mainly on college campuses, regarding the administration's support and response to Israel. But we also know that young people, say underneath the age of 26, of all races, ethnicities, and genders, tend not to vote. So can you grapple with us this conflict of lots of young people are energized to protest the administration, and yet we know from data they're not necessarily turning out in large numbers. So how do you think the conflict in Gaza will impact the 2024 presidential election?
I think it's going to have a pretty big impact, actually. One of the things that people are worried about when they ask that question typically is, are they going to vote Democrat or Republican? And I actually think that concern is not necessarily the primary issue here, as we're seeing the Republican Party having to shift to be more of a big tent party now that they have the never Trumpers and the only Trumpers. And that complication really changes the dynamic, the calculations that we need to make. As far as the young people themselves, yeah, I think 18 to 26, very often we malign and chastise young people for being politically disengaged. And we're seeing with this generation, Gen Z, and the Zoomers, that their disdain is not leading to disengagement. It's actually leading to more participation. We're seeing higher concentration of young people going to colleges and universities as tuitions continue to rise. And they want to be heard. And so as we were talking about earlier, we saw our colleague Tiffany Willoughby Herrard, faculty are coming out to universities to support these students. And so I think a better way to frame it for me would be to think about 18 to 26-year-olds as finding their way to becoming civically engaged. As we know that people get more engaged as they get older, particularly in electoral politics, 18 to 26 is just a time frame where they are becoming more comfortable going into the voting booth and deciphering, sometimes an illegible voter ballot that is complicated. There's all these people, you don't want to make a bad decision. And so we're seeing that. As far as, Students for Justice in Palestine, the Jewish Voice for Peace, all these student orgs that are engaged in protests, yes, I do think that their concerns with Biden as they are charging genocide, alongside the International Court of Justice, who, made their commentary about, made their ruling, I should say, about the case. The students are essentially saying that the world that we grew up in, being on Zoom, because of COVID, having to worry about school shootings, and now we have to have our names signed on and stamping weapons being sent abroad. This is a major concern for them. And as we see staffers, who are some of the most vulnerable people in a political party, resigning office, people in cabinet positions, people who have worked for the party for years, resigning office because they are also not feeling heard, I think it's important to make sure that the narrative around students continues to account for the fact that they have strong support and solidarity broadly. And so I think it's more incumbent upon the parties and the candidates to be able to connect with those young people and say, hey, actually, we want to be a part of what you have going on, as opposed to the kind of gatekeeping approach that has been the case in the US politics for far too long.
Yeah, so this is open to any of the panelists if you'd want to elaborate on this this moment in time about current politics as it relates to Gaza before I move on to another topic.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. So, excuse me. One of the things that I, noticed in all the panelists speaking, was this idea of feeling unheard and how that's actually playing out in political behavior. That is something that as a scholar on Black women in politics and also, within the capacity of Black Girls Vote, we are paying attention to, because one of the things that, we're finding in this enthusiasm gap, it seems to be almost kind of like an inverse to what Rashawn was saying, as, with Black men, feeling unheard, going to the other party. And what we've kind of noticed is that it's not necessarily Black women, shifting to other parties, but it's just having less voter apathy and less, enthusiasm, for the active voting period. One of the things that I've found, one of the data points, that we actually, have been looking at is that there was a recent poll in The Hill that talked about 39% of Black women between the ages of 18 to 39 being certain to vote. Why is that significant? That is a steep decline from the 69% in 2020 that said that they were certain to vote. So we're seeing that even though Black women are very supportive, of the party, what have you, there is kind of what they say, where there's smoke, there's fire, essentially with the feeling of, Black women and their participation. And as I said earlier, that definitely, has to do with, a lot of current events going on, again, what's going on with, the response to Gaza, what's going on to, various things that's almost kind of creating that voter apathy.
Yeah, I just want to
please
add one quick thing that I think is being highlighted here when we talk about young voters. If we take a person who's graduated from college right now, take the group that is graduating from Morehouse, they are now dealing with what's happening in Israel, also what's happening in Congo, what's happening in other parts in the Middle East that we don't talk about as much or enough. But accordingly, some of their graduations are being shut down due to protests that are happening on college campuses. Over 2,000 people have been arrested on college campuses over the past few months. That is a significantly high number. And so when we look at what they're experiencing right now with their college graduations, we go back 4 years. What happened? This same cohort was graduated from high school. They didn't have a graduation. They didn't have prom. That was related to COVID. We go back 4 years before that, and all of a sudden we had a situation where for many of them, as we look at pretty much the most racially diverse cohort of people that we've had in the United States, they were told, oh, you're growing up in the era of President Obama. We're past race. And then all of a sudden, for many of them, Trump was elected. And they're looking at their parents, their teachers, their friends, and they're like, you all lied to us. And now we want them to set up here and participate in this current political process as it's currently structured. In what world do we actually think that makes sense? So my point is, young people are being very rational in their responses right now. And I think Marcus highlighted it well, as did Ashley. Simply because they're saying they're less likely to vote does not mean they are not participating in the political process. And we know during the primaries that a non-vote was actually a protest and a signal that they wanted different candidates, that they also wanted different issues to come to bear, and that many of them do want to see a ceasefire. They don't want to see anyone killed, no matter if it's domestically or internationally. And so many ways when we look at young people, and you mentioned MLK earlier and kind of invoked him, whether it be talking about Biden going to Morehouse on Sunday or looking at Republicans and the way that they invoke MLK. MLK and others were doing their best work while being young. I mean, obviously, he didn't even live to be 40, right? So when we put all this together, oftentimes we discount young people when really they are screaming to the top of their lungs with their actions and their behaviors of what they actually want. And I think they're telling us that they want something different. They want term limits. They don't want to see people that are their great grandparents' age staying in office. They want to see them having the ability to participate, not just to protest, but to actually get elected. And I have to be part of the establishment to do so. So they're speaking loud and clearly. I just think oftentimes we are trying to mute them and inhibit their ability from actually participating.
Great points. Great points. So this issue about current events and young people, as particular as they're graduating into this current economic capitalistic society. Marcus, can you talk about the issue that Black people in general, but also Black voters, but young people in particular, and the party's handling of economic concerns? Like, how is it a messaging issue? Is it that there aren't enough jobs? Are the jobs just too competitive? What is going on with this potential economic issues that face Black voters, young Black voters too? And then I want to open it up to the economic threat that immigration may play. But first, the economy.
Sure. So I think we can go back to what Rashawn was saying about students and young people and what they're saying and listening to them. So a part of what is happening right now is they are hearkening back to the boycott, divest, and sanction movement that we saw in the 80s and 90s against apartheid South Africa. And a part of that movement is basically telling us that our colleges and universities are making major investments in the military industrial complex. And I think at some point we need to ask ourselves, why is it a way to make money to export war across the world? So as we get to the immigration question, we have to think about why people are migrating most often is because of this exporting of war under the guise of democracy. And so when we talk about capitalism, I think there's a necessarily a direct relationship there. We have to think about the ways that investment economies are built on labor that is increasingly devalued and undersupported. And so as folks are going to colleges and universities, as the costs are skyrocketing, as housing costs are skyrocketing, as rents are skyrocketing, we're seeing more visibly than ever with social media, we're seeing wealthy people living the dream. They're having a great time. They're just vibing out. They're on a beach somewhere in some country that, there are 17 military bases at. And so we have to think more specifically about what does it mean that a person who comes in and works with us every single day can't afford to pay rent and eat good food, who doesn't have a grocery store in their neighborhood, who can't park their car in their neighborhood if they can afford a car, who can't get on the scooter app because they don't make it for the phone that they're using, right? And these are very practical concerns and everyday concerns for people who are sick and tired of being sick and tired, to quote Fannie Lou Hamer. And so I think when we think about capitalism, a lot of times people think about trade and markets. They think about wealth and opportunities for upward mobility. When we talk about capitalism as scholars and intellectuals and people who are invested in community work, we're talking about the exploitation of workers. We're talking about managerial and executive staff making thousands of times what the lowest paid staff are making. And so these are the parents of the young people. These are the young people themselves. These are older people who are losing their jobs and not being given opportunities to re-enter the workforce at a level that is appropriate for them. People aren't earning livable wages. The system is simply not working. It hasn't worked. And that's why we will talk about late stage capitalism, relying on investments in militarism to keep down folks who are trying to create a system that actually works for, as the politicians like to say, Main Street before Wall Street. So these things are all connected. And I think it's really important to find opportunities like this and people like this who are able to have these conversations in a sincere and honest way, and allows us to basically explain to people what the point of all this education was for us, is that we can have a certain expertise that can be a heuristic for others and say, you don't have to know everything about everything. We can hear your pain and your suffering. We can put words to it, and we can create a plan together to be able to push forward and pass some of these problems.
Thank you. Rashawn, can you add to this conversation about immigration and the economy?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, look, I think Marcus nailed it when we look at people's everyday experiences. And of course, part of what is also driving this is a group threat ideology. Oftentimes in the social sciences and sociology and psychology, we talk about group threat theory. Group threat theory contends that when there's a sizable proportion of a minority group moving into an area, that group tends to pose an economic threat when it comes to jobs and resources, a political threat when it comes to voting in the status quo, and also a cultural threat. And part of what we're seeing with immigration is that being the case. What's happening at the southern border is not just a conservative or Republican issue, particularly when we are seeing individuals being shipped or having access oftentimes to urban areas, as urban areas and more democratic states have become sanctuary cities and sanctuary places. And while I think there are a lot of people who are fine with that, there are also some people who are not, including some Black people. And I think there are a lot of Black people saying, wow, okay, we're here struggling to try to get a job, to find housing, all the things that Marcus just laid out so eloquently, is that part of then that immigrant group becomes a threat to the individuals in that community. And it's not just about being a threat to white people, it's also a threat to Black people. And I think that's something that's real. And I think oftentimes across the board, Democrats are being blamed for being more laissez-faire or hands-off, or even enabling some of these things from happening. And this is one of the ways where Republicans are much better than Democrats at this. I mean, the whole putting migrants and immigrants on a bus or a plane and sending them to another part of the country is deliberate. It's deliberate about where they're sending them to. They're thinking about the votes. They're thinking about apathy. They're thinking about mobilization. So you send them to a place, yeah, it might not lead to them voting Republican, but people might say, I'm just going to stay home, or I'm going to vote in the local elections and not pay as much attention to what's happening at the presidential level. Or all of a sudden our barbershop conversations change, our conversations at the hairstylist in the church changes because of that particular action that's happening. And overwhelmingly Democrats are being blamed in these areas. And these are oftentimes local Democrats, where you might have Black elected officials, Black mayors, county executives, or what have you. So immigration is also an issue for people who are voting Democrat. And I think the point that was brought up earlier, that simply because Black people vote Democrat doesn't mean that they don't have conservative values and ideologies. It's just that right now, the Democratic Party is the party that they perceive helps them to actually gain more equity and equality. So immigration is a big issue, and it's something that I think Democrats are going to have to grapple with.
Indeed, I agree that they will have to, the Democratic Party, just as the Republican Party, has to deal with immigration. But this also puts us on the path of a Biden-Trump rematch. Ashley, how are Black women that you have spoken with and organizing with, how are they feeling? What are they thinking about with this 2024 election rematch between Biden and Trump?
I mean, all I can say is, they tired. We tired. We're tired. But no, seriously. Yeah, again, that is where we are, really seeing a more you know, clear, feeling of voter apathy and lack of enthusiasm. In the meeting that we had yesterday, among our members, we were talking about how Black women are, going to the polls, but it's just kind of like a, here we are again kind of thing. And again, that's something that I applaud organizations, like ours and some of our partners, and really again just drilling down and saying what is wrong, what are you feeling. And I think not only I would say the organizations like NCNW, Black Girls Vote, Higher Heights, also some of the sororities are taking that same approach over since 2020. I believe that almost all members of the D9 essentially have social welfare organizations and PACs and things of that nature, to have more strategic conversations around political engagement and civic knowledge. So again, there is more of a conversation about what is going on, to try to essentially say hey, I know how you're feeling, I know you're not enthused about it, but there are a lot of things that are on the line here essentially that should really just motivate you to vote. Also, another approach that Black Girls Vote has taken is really just getting out into the community. So it really is going. So this is the first primary show since COVID. So essentially, this idea of we outside. We've gone to numerous community events. We've gone to we've had a high school takeover essentially in Baltimore, where not only did we register the high schoolers to vote, but we also strategically found ways to get them to the polls. So it's not just getting you registered to vote, it's also walking you through the entire process to make sure that you are knowledgeable, you're comfortable, and you're able to say, okay, now that I've registered, what else? And we're kind of taking you through the what else essentially.
Thank you. Matt, what can you report to us about voters nationally feeling about this Trump and Biden rematch?
Yeah, so I think that there's a disbelief in communities all across America that we're actually back at this place where post Donald Trump's presidency in January 6th, a lot of voters thought, well, there's no way that he can continue, to be in the political scene, including, I should note, many of his diehard supporters early on. And then many people in 2020, there was an active conversation over whether or not Biden was going to be a one-term president. And while the campaign is very strenuous to remind you that they never officially committed to that, there was potentially an implication of that. And a lot of Americans, cast a ballot for Biden, thinking that he was only going to be in there for one term. So this is something that, in particular for Black voters, there is a sense of frustration and exasperation oftentimes that when I interact with Black voters and go out onto the trail, but I don't think that that's necessarily unique to Black voters. What is unique in this moment is Black voters' particular frustrations with the perennial issue, shall I say, of the politics of and interests of Black communities not necessarily being always the top of the policy priorities of either party necessarily, even though Black voters are consistently seen as one of the most important political blocs to win. I mean, Republicans this year have outlined, multiple policy plans that and campaign strategy, shall I say, to reach out to Black voters, while at the same time not necessarily having on the policy end, a substantive vision for what Black America wants and needs. And while Joe Biden has in many ways made the most diverse administration in history and has made the most promises and investments, and deliveries on a Black agenda, he actually has outlined a very robust Black agenda in many ways and has his campaign is quick to point out often that they've delivered on many of those things. They are not necessarily, they still have not fulfilled basic things such as, the George Floyd Justice Policing Act, the, voting, expansive voting rights at the federal level, an economic agenda that Black Americans see themselves reflected in, not just necessarily an economic agenda for all of America. These are some of the things that when Black Americans look at this election, and when I go and talk with folks, that people are especially frustrated by. Like, a lot of promises were made, and Black Americans in this moment have, in many ways, really feeling like we're both coming into our own as a community, politically, culturally, economically, but then also are frustrated by the lack of progress amid a period where there is, we should note, high levels of, backlash and high visibility for the Black community. I mean, we were debating the role of the Civil War in the Republican primary, and the role of Black history in schools, and the role of DEI and affirmative action. Like, Black Americans feel hyper visible in our politics at the moment, but not necessarily politically empowered in a lot of ways, and that's a frustrating thing when you're not being given oftentimes candidates who may be able to offer new solutions or even just a new face or demeanor in your political environment. So a lot of Black folks at the moment are going to engage with the political process. We have no indication that Black voters are going to be disproportionately dropping out of the system compared to other voters. Everyone is exhausted this year. Nobody really likes this rematch, except for the most diehard supporters. But I do think that there's some uniqueness to why Black voters feel frustrated, and why Black voters feel that this year is especially unfair, given the 8 years really of racial debates and really decades actually of hypervisibility that Black Americans have had in our politics.
Thank you so much. So at this moment, I'm going to turn specifically to audience questions, and that I will target them to all the panelists, and then also ask specifically one panelist maybe to answer a question. So first off is, and this tails on Matt's comment about the George Floyd and policing, the acts that were promised to do to change policing practices. So this is for the panelists at large, is how do Black Republicans or conservative leaning voters deal with the high level of racism in the Republican Party?
Well,
go ahead, Rashawn.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say I think a lot of them disconnect from it, to be honest with you. I think that similarly to a lot of voters who vote for Trump, they say, oh, he's just talking. This is just banter. The media focuses too much on it. Some individuals also view his court cases to be witch hunts. Of course, there are people on the other side who don't think that to be the case. But I think more importantly, part of what's happening is that they disconnect, and demographically, we start to see a different group. First, we got to once again say, and I think all of us have said it, we are talking about a very small percentage of Black people overall. And then when you get into that, you see that they're more likely to be men. They are more likely to have higher incomes. They are also more likely to be conservative religiously, and they are also more likely to be immigrants. So you put these combinations together and you start to get a particular ideal type of a person who you could actually see that happening. Just on the immigrant front, there's research by whether it be Ryan Cobb at Rutgers, or Todd Hamilton at Princeton, or even Kevin Thomas at UT Austin, where they're showing that most of the individuals who report being likely to vote for Trump, who are Black Republicans, fit this demographic that I just laid out. And part of fitting this demographic is, if you know anything about the immigration literature, is that oftentimes first generation immigrants, regardless of their racial and ethnic background, they come over with this American dream in their mind in a very idealistic way. And then they look at native born Black people and they say, you should be doing more than what you're actually doing. And depending on where they're coming from in the world, based on what they're seeing, that can make sense. But the one thing we know about research is by the second generation, those second generation immigrant outcomes are similar to native born Black people. And that is because, unfortunately, we live in a highly racialized society that is imbued with systemic inequality. And so all of a sudden their views start to change. But that first demographic group is one to really point out. So overall, I think oftentimes they discount what he's saying They view it as a trope. And then there's a small percentage who actually believe some of those things about their own people. And I don't think we talk about that enough.
Very, very true. And we don't have enough time on this panel to delve into that particular issue. So, Ashley, Patricia asks, what can white allies do to support Black voters and Black voting rights organizations? And I'd also like then Marcus to answer that question, is what white allies can do to support Black organizations.
One thing I would say, excuse me, is helping with resourcing, is very important, to Black organizations. When you're thinking about any kind of grassroots, effort, resourcing is always a challenge, and it doesn't necessarily look like, volunteer hours. It can also look like, money. That is being a big thing, essentially. So, providing any kind of resourcing support for those efforts, helping to amplify those efforts, I would say is probably the biggest thing that, allies can do essentially.
100% agree. And I'd also add, I think it's important to be more than allies, but to be accomplices. So be a part of what is going on, right? Like celebrate the things that I'm celebrating and be hurt when the things that hurt me are happening. This is the basis of solidarity, that you need to be committed in the same ways that we are committed. And that means, our pain, our joys and our pains are being shared. I also think it's really important for white people to learn the difference between white as a racial identity and whiteness as a thing that America and the world, the United States and the world upholds. It is a broader system of whiteness that they can divest from. But in order to do that, they really have to get into the questions of what does it mean to make somebody white? What does it mean to make groups of people superior and others subordinate? What does it mean to create space for communities? One of the exercises I do in most of my classes is I ask them to think about their life in 15 or 20 years and everything that they ever wanted to accomplish was done, that they succeeded at everything they wanted. And for them, 15 to 20 years is forever. So shout out to them. And I asked them, okay, so all that happened, describe your neighborhood. And every single time they described what we would see today as a displaced, gentrified white neighborhood. And so what I want when I talk about divesting from whiteness, it's about changing the way that you understand community, the way you understand neighborhoods, the way you understand place and space, the way that you move about the world and this country, the way that you move about in your everyday life. And being able to do that bears consequences. It means that you aren't going to have that same relationship with your uncle. You're not going to have that same relationship with your niece and nephew. You're not going to have the same relationship with your friends from college. And that's what the choices that we have to make every day. So as Rashawn was pointing out, there are Black people who don't like Black people constantly. And we have to be able to deal with that. We have to deal with that. You can choose and you need to.
Thank you so much. So Matt, I don't want to put you on the spot because you're our AP reporter. However, the recent U.S. Senate election in Maryland, literally just the other day, and the polls were so wrong. Can we just as a panel talk about the polls? The media, of course, gets on the polls. They make it a horse race election. And so, Matt, I don't necessarily have a question, but just can you tell us from a reporter's perspective the importance of polls and their usage, and then us academics can critique them?
So the first thing that I will say is that AP has very, very high standards and very particular standards that I think are a bit different from the rest of the media in terms of what polls we're allowed to cite. Like not every single poll is allowed to be referenced in AP copy. And more importantly, that is because AP calls the elections. So we don't discuss what is the data necessarily beforehand, because our polling team has the very important job of actually doing the analysis on who is really winning based on precinct to precinct. So I have a lot of respect and for my colleagues who do that work and believe that from our perspective, everyone else can get into the horse race game, but this come November, AP is going to call the presidential election, and that's what is going to be the result. So I think that from our perspective, we can say that is what is most important, is what actually happens on election day, and that there's a lot of data that goes into understanding where the actual, votes will not come from. I think that in this moment, a lot of people are frustrated with polling, and there is a genuine social science debate over how can we representatively have polling samples? What is the best way to get a hold of people in this new environment where not everyone necessarily, has is even able to be reached. So there's a data collection problem oftentimes with polls, but then there's also a question of, is your model accurately going to represent what is the electorate going to look like on election day? One thing that we've seen with Donald Trump in every single time he's been on the ballot is that he pulls out a lot of low propensity white people, which is a community that oftentimes in American history, voters and pollsters have not thought about necessarily, in the same way that, for instance, in some recent Southern elections, we've seen voting rights groups really focus on pulling in more Black and working class voters into the electorate. This is something that electorate engineering is something that, whether it's through laws or through activism, this country is very, very engaged with and obsessed with at the moment. And I think that that is at least one aspect of why polling is so difficult, because the electorate literally looks different from election to election, more so than it ever has. So you can't necessarily predict who's going to show up.
Totally true. Rashawn, 1 minute polling.
Look, I mean, Matt nailed it. I think it's a methodological issue. I think it's a sampling issue. You never know who's going to turn out. I mean, we haven't talked a lot about access to broadband and technology. Matt essentially mentioned it. Who are you missing in rural areas? Oftentimes we talk about low income voters of color. But as Matt just highlighted, we also have to talk about rural white voters who are less likely to come out. We always stress voter turnout for white people, and it's not significantly really that high to begin with. I mean, it doesn't really get out of the 60s in terms of percentages. So I think that it's a big issue. And as Matt mentioned, what's really important, there's something that I use. It is a media bias chart where you can actually see the most objective media outlets. AP is always at the top and the center of that. And I think it's important for people to pay attention to that. The final point I'll make is that oftentimes these polls are national polls where they're trying to get a nationally representative sample. But that is not how our actual electoral process operates. It is based on states and electoral college. So if you're looking at a national poll, oftentimes in the past few elections, Democrats have done very well in the general election when it comes to just overall population vote. But that is not what gets you to 270. What gets you to 270 is how you win states. And so I think polling really has to shift and change because people are really starting to lose faith in it.
And just a side note, Rashawn's talking about 270 electoral college votes to win the presidency. And the idea of having 270 electoral college votes is based on state wide races. So before we wrap up, there is one question that actually came from the pre-questions that several audience members asked is, will Brookings be holding other similar events to discuss Latino politics, Asian American politics, and other racial and ethnic groups? And the answer is yes. So stay tuned and make sure you get your Brookings notices and emails, because there will be multiple webinars forthcoming about the 2024 presidential election and different voting blocks, and that they will be having more and more conversations about it. I would like to thank each of my panelists. Thank you so much for showing up, sharing your brilliance with the audience. I'd like to thank each of the audience members for taking time out of your busy schedules, and to stay tuned for more coming from Brookings. Thank you.